Flamethrower boasting fading stars, acid dip cigarette smoking stuntmen taking on Bruce Lee, and the rewriting of one of the most tragic moments in Hollywood history. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is an hilarious and at times quite moving blast from the rewritten past, and a 161-minute gift that just keeps on giving. So throw on your shades and get ready to discover many a fascinating detail within this epic Hollywood tale that you probably didn't catch during your first few viewings. Because I am Gareth, this is What Culture, and here are 20 things you somehow missed in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Number 20, Margo Robbie wears some of Sharon Tate's jewelry. Though she ultimately may not have spoken words in the finished flick quite as often as many may have hoped, the moments Margo Robbie does get to wander around the screen as Sharon Tate in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood are still rather gripping. The Australian actor radiates star quality as the young Hollywood sensation, and fully captures the captivating presence of Tate throughout. What you may not have realised, however, is that one of the major ways that Robbie was able to connect so strongly with Tate as a character during the making of the film was by wearing some of her real-life jewelry. Said bling was loaned to her by Tate's sister Deborah, and not only was Robbie actually wearing some of Tate's very own jewelry during the flick itself, she also borrowed some of the late star's partially used perfume when getting into character too. That's pretty cool. Number 19, Michael Madsen's Cadillac making its second Tarantino appearance. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood boasts a number of Tarantino regulars, with the likes of Kurt Russell, Zoe Bell, Bruce Dern, and Michael Madsen all coming back for one more QT ride. What you likely missed though when watching many of those sequences involving Brad Pitt's Cliff Booth just cruising down a Los Angeles highway is that the vehicle he was driving, which was actually owned by Rick Dalton in the movie, was also returning for another appearance in the Tarantino universe. Said 1966 Cadillac Coupe Derville actually belonged to, of all people, the aforementioned Michael Madsen, with it also being driven in Reservoir Dogs by the actor in that 1992 instant classic Tarantino movie. That's not the only returning vehicle that pulled into this Hollywood tale either. Number 18, the bride's car shows up again. Yep, that's right, joining Michael Madsen's absolutely gorgeous cream vehicle turning up for another appearance in a Tarantino movie is the 1964 Volkswagen Carmen Ghia that's also driven around by Cliff Booth in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. You likely didn't spot the fact that Uma Thurman's The Bride infamously drove the exact same model and colour during Kill Bill Volume 2, and in a scene which saw Thurman eventually actually crash into a tree in real life, something that Tarantino himself has classed as the biggest mistake of his life. And in another interesting note, it turns out that Tarantino's own stepfather also drove him around in the exact same car back in '69, which is pretty cool. And it's also the exact same year that this film is set. Number 17, that's the actual Playboy Mansion. Early on in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, QT takes viewers to a party at the iconic Playboy Mansion, with this get-together containing a few famous Hollywood faces, including Sharon Tate, Steve McQueen, and Michelle Phillips, all letting their hair down a little. You may be wondering how they were able to recreate such a realistic-looking version of the mansion for this scene. But many did not realize that this was actually very much the real deal. That's right, this was the actual Playboy Mansion on screen. After speaking with the person that now owned the mansion that once belonged to Hugh Hefner, of course, Tarantino and the gang were able to add in as many details as they could from that specific time before they began shooting the party sequence. However, it is worth noting that the Playboy magazine owner Hefner only actually moved into the property in 1971, so a Playboy party at the location in '69 wouldn't have really been possible, would it? Number 16, a Jango Unchained set was used for the movie. Did you catch the somewhat familiar setting visible during the opening scenes of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood? As Rick Dalton and Cliff Booth sit down for an interview with Alan Kincaid on the set of NBC's Western TV show Bounty Law, the pair are shown to be sitting in the middle of the show's ranch set. And that very same Bounty Law location, Melody Ranch, was actually used all the way back when Quentin Tarantino was also shooting Jango Unchained, with that set also being reused for some of the Lancer TV show scenes that are found during Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Put simply, Melody Ranch, the same place that has been used as a set for the likes of The Lone Ranger and Westworld, has very much become a major part of the Tarantino-verse. Number 15, the meta Zoe Bell appearance. As already mentioned, the terrific Zoe Bell has been a frequent collaborator with Quentin Tarantino over the years. Being Uma Thurman's stunt double during the Kill Bill films, also doing a few stunts for Inglorious Bastards, starring as herself in Death Proof, appearing in the Hateful Eight, and popping up as stunt coordinator Janet Lloyd in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. But if you weren't aware of Bell's history of working with Tarantino beforehand, and the fact she was actually acting as the stunt coordinator on set for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, it would have been easy to miss the fact that her role in this 2019 Hollywood tale was actually about as wonderfully meta as it gets. With the knowledge of Bell herself very much being in charge of ensuring that all stunts were performed safely during the flick, watching her unleash hell as Janet at the sight of stuntman Cliff Booth carelessly beating up Bruce Lee and wrecking her car in the process becomes that little bit funnier. Number 14, the Inglorious Bastards fiery connection. Along with the aforementioned Jango Unchained set being visible during Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, there's also another fascinating realer-than-real Tarantino universe connection seemingly present in this movie that is quite easily missed. The director famously opted to murder Adolf Hitler within a movie theatre in his version of history during the events of Inglorious Bastards, with that explosive scene eventually seeing many a Nazi getting horrifically burned alive. And sure enough, when talking about Dalton's career with Al Pacino's casting agent Marvin Schwartz, a film by the name of The 14 Fists of McCluskey is mentioned. Viewers then see Dalton creating a familiarly fiery scenario as the actor sets fire to a room full of Nazi officers, this time via flamethrower. Though it's not a perfect replication of the Inglorious events, it definitely feels like a nod to that other previous Tarantino burning Nazi scene. Number 13, the Kato fight homage. Speaking of nods and homages present in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Tarantino actually managed to sneak in a pretty cool physical detail into Bruce Lee's fight with Cliff Booth. You see, as Lee and Booth both throw down on the set of The Green Hornet, it was actually pointed out by the author of Bruce Lee: A Life, Matthew Polly, that the guy playing Bruce Lee in the movie, Mike Moe, well, he wasn't actually fighting like Bruce Lee would in real life. He was unleashing a style created by Lee for the character that he played in that aforementioned series, Kato. Specifically, the jumping sidekick that Moe delivers during the fight is pure Kato, according to Polly. And he also explained how the first few punches and blocks seen during that fight felt more like traditional Hong Kong Kung Fu movie choreography. To summarize, Lee also wearing Kato's black gloves during this particular fight with Brad Pitt's Cliff Booth just made Polly feel like the entire thing was more of a Kato homage than a Bruce Lee homage fighting-wise. So now you know. Number 12, the many pieces of Hollywood foreshadowing. The frequently stunning and satisfying world of Los Angeles in 1969 created by Tarantino for this 2019 dramedy isn't just something that's nice to look at and listen to. I mean, it is that of course, but it also contains a few subtle moments of foreshadowing if you're listening and looking hard enough. Take some of the music heard when Cliff Booth is just driving his way around Hollywood, for example. The Neil Diamond tune by the name of Brother Love's Traveling Salvation Show actually mentions very early on a hot August night. Something that feels like a bit of a nod towards the fiery events that go down at the very end of the film. You know the ones. Then you also have the moment Rick Dalton explains the contents of his book to his young co-star Trudy Fraser on the set of Lancer. With his comments of the cowboy involved injuring his hip and slowly becoming more useless by the day, predicting how his stunt double Cliff Booth actually injures his own hip at the end of the movie when he gets stabbed by one of the Manson family invaders. Booth would then note how he wouldn't die from the injury, he'd probably just walk away from it with a bit of a limp, himself possibly becoming slightly more useless by the day in the aftermath. Number 11, the Tarantino-verse brands. Along with this movie's few instances of marvelous foreshadowing, the much-loved Tarantino-verse brands are also there to be found throughout. Now, obviously, it wasn't too hard to spot the brilliant nod to QT's legendary Red Apple cigarettes brand during the movie's end credits scene, with that scene being a commercial for the brand starring Rick Dalton himself. And there's a little bit more on that later on. What less folks may have spotted was the passing mention of another Tarantino brand within this Once Upon a Time in Hollywood tale. Look closely at a bus moving through the streets of LA in one scene and you will spot on the side of it a big old advertisement for Big Kahuna Burger. You know, the fast food joint seen in everything from Reservoir Dogs to Pulp Fiction. Honestly, I hear they got some tasty burgers there. Oh yeah, and thanks for tapping on this particularly tasty video today too. If you're liking what you're watching, then hit that subscribe button down below for more What Culture on your screen. Number 10, that's the real Maltese Falcon. As Margo Robbie Sharon Tate wanders into a bookstore to pick up a copy of Tess of the Dervilles that she'd ordered, more on that later, you'll likely remember the star sharing a moment with a little statue of a falcon. You may not have clocked that this wasn't just any old little birdie though. This was actually the Maltese Falcon seen in the titular 1941 movie. Not only that, you also likely didn't realise that this wasn't simply a prop designed specifically for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood to be used here. It was 100% one of the real falcons used in that 1941 movie. It turns out that Leonardo DiCaprio is actually a part of a group that owns one of these iconic little pieces of movie history. Apparently, a few of them were made for the original Maltese Falcon movie, with this specific statuette going missing for 50 years before finally popping up at a flea market in 1993. It was eventually sold to DiCaprio and his pals for $300,000 and ultimately popped up in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood in this very scene. How cool! Number 9. Tess of the Dervilles. As previously mentioned, the reason that Sharon Tate found herself in this Maltese Falcon boasting Westwood bookstore in the first place was due to the fact she wanted to buy a copy of Thomas Hardy's Tess of the Dervilles, a pure woman faithfully presented for her partner, infamous director Roman Polanski. Far from being just a random old book, you may have missed the fact that this was actually a novel that eventual fugitive Polanski, who would flee the US in 1997 after pleading guilty to statutory rape, would later go on to direct when it was adapted into a big screen feature in 1979. The story goes that the director was inspired to make the movie after being gifted a copy of the book by his wife, Tate. In reality, said novel was actually bought when Sharon was in Europe, not LA, and after giving Polanski the book and saying how she'd love to star in that particular movie one day, she hopped on a plane and went back to America. That'd be the last time her husband saw Sharon, because after she got back to America, she was then murdered by the Manson family whilst Polanski stayed over in Europe completing a film. When the drama, eventually titled Tess, was released a decade later, it contained the words, "To Sharon." Number 8. Cliff's Hateful Coffee Pot. On top of various top stars and vehicles returning for one more Tarantino adventure, a little old prop decided to add another Tarantino film to its CV during Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Keep an eye on the background as Cliff prepares dinner for both himself and his loyal pup Brandy, and you'll be able to see a very much blue coffee pot sitting on the stove. That very same item is also seen during Tarantino's previous film, The Hateful Eight, too, with it being the same pot that would ultimately contain some poisoned coffee in that 2015 Western. As one rather sharp Reddit user would comment, hopefully they washed it out before it landed in Booth's kitchen, yeah? Number 7. A real Manson song was sung. As already noted during this list, Tarantino's use of music and the various things that are heard on the radio, or we'll get there, in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is actually quite fascinating. But it's also unexpectedly chilling on occasion too. You know that song we hear the various young girl members of the Manson family singing when we're first introduced to them during the movie? Well, though you no doubt didn't miss the fact that it was really creepy, you probably didn't know that this particular song was an a cappella version of one that Charles Manson himself wrote. That song is called I'll Never Say Never to Always and could be found on the cult leader / singer-songwriter's 1970 album, Lie, The Love and Terror Cult. Lovely. Thankfully though, as confirmed by the movie's music supervisor Mary Ramos to Variety, they were informed after choosing to spend money on the song to use it in the feature that no one associated with the Mansons or the Manson family saw a single penny of that money. Instead, a trust was set up for the victims, so that's something. Number 6. Quentin Tarantino's hidden poster cameo. While this one isn't something you could technically miss within the movie itself, it is quite a fun little cameo that you probably didn't spot on your way into the theatre to watch the 2019 hit. Hidden amongst an utterly gorgeous retro promotional poster for the movie that boasted just about every single character in the damn thing is none other than the director himself making yet another cameo of sorts in one of his pictures. Over the years, QT has shown up in everything from Reservoir Dogs to Jango Unchained, of course, and adds a small appearance sitting behind a camera in this poster to his ever-growing list of cameos. Because why the hell not, eh? Oh, and he also voiced the director of the Red Apple commercial too, which is pretty fun. Number 5. The disappearing rearview mirror and Rick's rapidly changing hair. No movie is perfect, folks, and the odd continuity error here and there is to be expected, even in a movie as big and well crafted as Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Sure enough, the two leading stars themselves, Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio, actually find themselves in the middle of a pair of easily missed mistakes in the runtime. While the former roams around LA in Michael Madsens' Cadillac, just keep a close eye on his rearview mirror, because it goes from being there, he's even checking it, just looking behind him, doing all that kind of stuff, to disappearing completely. Now, this was probably probably done because they were obviously shooting over, like, Brad Pitt's shoulder from behind, and the mirrors there, you might have been able to see the camera, so that's probably why it happened, but it still sticks out like a sore thumb once you look at it. Then you have Rick Dalton's magical locks. Oh, I'm jealous. As the fading star talks about his hair with Sam Wanamaker, keep an eye on it because it goes from being really messy at one stage to being completely slicked back, all without DiCaprio ever once touching it on screen. Now good luck on seeing that, my friends. Number 4, the 1969 Columbia Pictures logo. Another cute detail that may have passed more than a few viewers by was visible during the opening few seconds of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. The specific Columbia Pictures logo that could be found here before the movie had even begun was actually the exact same one that was used all the way back in 1969. Again, the year that this movie was set. A Sony company was also added to the iconic image of a lady holding a torch. With this studio, a massive one during the golden age of Hollywood, actually being bought by Sony in 1989, and adding their company to the image from 1996 onwards. Nice touch, cutie. Number 3, all those radio ads are actually real. Back to the many intriguing sounds heard during Quentin Tarantino's love letter to LA, and to the various radio announcements and tunes heard playing within the vehicles found in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Again, you'd be forgiven for assuming that the ads in particular were simply specifically created for the movie. But the truth is, a ton of viewers were actually obliviously listening to some very real commercials and DJ intro and outros that the director and music supervisor Mary Ramos put together after listening to 14 hours worth of 93 KHJ radio from the 68 to 69 period. In the end, Tarantino decided that all of the tunes, the commercials, the DJ intro and outros that could be heard in his movie had to be ones that were very much used on that station back in the day too. Because in his words, if it didn't play on KHJ radio in that time, it just felt like he was cheating. And in the end, fans were gifted with one of the greatest and most authentic driving soundtracks of all time. Number 2, a rather iconic scream. Another quick notable piece of audio that you may have possibly missed as you were settling down for your first, second, or even third viewing of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. During the opening stages of the picture, as we see Rick Dalton gunning down enemies as Jake Cahill in Bounty Law, listen out for the noise that erupts from one of his wounded foes as they fall off a roof. Yep, that's very much the iconic Wilhelm scream that's been heard in everything from Toy Story to Star Wars over the years, being used within the first minute of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Tarantino just couldn't make a movie about all things Hollywood without tipping his own hat to the most iconic sound effect in movie history, could he? Number 1, so many iconic LA locations are visible. Finally, Quentin Tarantino's love letter to Los Angeles in 1969 was always going to shine a spotlight on some of the area's most iconic landmarks. And whilst being swept away by all of the larger-than-life characters and the consistently mesmerizing soundtrack and locations seen and heard here, many probably didn't realize that a lot of the moments that were captured on camera were actually filmed within and in front of these legendary real-life LA places. The real Musso and Frank Grill, where Rick actually sits down for a meeting with Marvin early on, as we've already mentioned, was actually used to shoot that marvelous scene, with Hollywood's oldest eatery being shut down for 5 days for the shoot. The place worked a treat, mostly because it looks pretty much the exact same way it has done since it opened in 1919. They even got to use plates from the 60s too, what more can you ask for? The aforementioned real Playboy Mansion also pops up on screen, and the Mexican restaurant El Coyote where Sharon Tate ate her last meal makes an appearance, with Margo Robbie even shooting her scenes in the same booth that Tate sat in with her pals for the feature. Tarantino also rolled back the years by replacing the LED marquees on the iconic Bruin Theatre and the Fox Village Theatres in Westwood Village with real ones. Briefly turned a Taco Bell into a hamburger hamlet, a Starbucks into an Italian cafe, and gave Stan's Donut Shop, a joint that had been open since the mid-60s, a makeover too. Put simply, the director and the rest of his team did everything they could to make LA as much of an eye-catching character as the rest of their absolutely stacked cast. And they did a pretty good job too, if I do say so myself. Very well played.